Shebonening, Shebonening. This sketch, called Shebonening, was published in 1855 by Lawrence Oliphant, former Civil Secretary and Superintendent General of Indian Affairs in Canada. We are looking toward the west end of the channel. George Island is on the left side of the sketch. On the right, on the mainland, is de Lamorandière's trading post and part of the village of Shebonening. Ani and G'day. My name is Adele Loosemore, and I am a Robinson Treaty Indian from Shebonening. My community is at the entrance to the North Channel of Georgian Bay. And I put a white dot on the map below so you can see where we are located. Today we're going to look at the family history charts in the Métis Nation of Ontario's membership register. A chart for each verified Métis family line. Our First Nations ancestors are Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. But the Métis Nation of Ontario and the Province of Ontario decided to change their ethnic identity to Métis. They did this by distorting some parts of the historic record and ignoring other parts of it. This manipulation of our ethnic identity is deeply disrespectful to our ancestors and our community, and it violates the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This series of videos was created to show you that their claims are not supported by the historic record. I'm going to begin this video by sharing with you some data relating to a concept called effective control, which relates to all of the families in MNO's Killarney Métis community. And then we'll take a look at the genealogical charts that MNO has in their membership register for the families of Shebonening. I'm going to pay special attention to the documented Métis in those charts. In the Powley decision, the date of effective control is part of a legal test used to establish a Métis Aboriginal right. It is part of what is called the post-contact but pre-control test. It involves evidence that an activity, for example harvesting, in a historic Métis community was being carried out by Métis people after Europeans first arrived in that area, but before the time that the historic Métis community came under the control and influence of European laws and customs. The 2017 MNO Ontario Joint Fact Sheet about Killarney says 1815 to 1850. As recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada in Powley, the Upper Great Lakes area is largely under the control of Aboriginal communities who formed the dominant population during this period. They're claiming that the Métis had control of the historic Métis community of Killarney sometime between 1815 and 1850, when Europeans took control of the area. So the date of effective control is 1850. But it's widely accepted as historical fact that it was Anishinaabe people who were in the large territory on the North Shore, before, during, and after that same time period. Look at the vast area of land that the settler government labeled on this map as Chippewa hunting country. The map was compiled at the request of Lieutenant Governor John Simcoe and published in 1813, not long before the Métis supposedly began to show up in the historic Métis community of Killarney. Here's another map from 1833, 20 years later, with the same notation on it. Chippewa hunting country. And this is a map from 1842, also marking the Chippewa hunting country. Of course, our ancestors did more than hunt in that country, and the settler government repeatedly acknowledged this Ojibwe territory in many ways for many years. Some of the leaders of the Great Lakes Anishinaabe refused to allow trespassers on their lands to continue using mineral resources without their permission. So in 1849, Alexander Vidal, a surveyor, and T.G. Anderson, superintendent of Indian Affairs, were sent to meet with the Ojibwe bands along the north shore of Lake Huron and Lake Superior to gather information about their territories and report back to the settler government about their interest in making a treaty. Mapping was included with their report, and part of it is shown here. Vidal and Anderson noted that most territories were well known and acknowledged by neighboring First Nations people. The red arrow is pointing towards the word Jabonining. There was no mention in the 1849 report about a Métis people who claimed an enormous portion of the mainland, along with Manitoulin Island. The whole purpose of Vidal and Anderson's trip was to gather information about territories. It's not believable that a Métis community this large would have escaped everyone's attention. Vidal and Anderson's report was used to help formulate the Robinson-Huron and Robinson-Superior treaties of 1850. Highly significant historical events that MNO and Ontario disregarded when they created their fake historic Métis community of Killarney and environs. But MNO's 2017 registry policy didn't follow what the Supreme Court said, and it didn't follow what the MNO Ontario fact sheet said. Instead, on page 9 of their policy, MNO says that for Killarney, there is a range of dates for effective control, from the mid-1870s to the mid-1880s. In MNO's verified Métis documents, the date of effective control varies according to the date that families arrived in the historic Métis community. The left column of this table shows quotes from MNO's verified Métis documents about the year that each family arrived in the Killarney historic Métis community. In the right-hand column, titled EC, is MNO's date of effective control. It's different for each family, which doesn't make sense to me because I thought that effective control is supposed to relate to the date that the historic Métis community came under European control. The first row shows a quote about the Lamorandiers. And it says that the earliest reference to the family being in the Métis community is in 1839. And then it says this shows that they arrived about 45 years prior to effective control. If you add together 1839 plus 45 years, that means effective control is 1884. And their reference to the family arrival is the baptismal record of Marie Anne de Lamorandiere, who was baptized in 1839 and later married William Rousseau. For the Solomons, in the second row, MNO says the date they arrived is 1848, over 2 decades before effective control. So in this case, effective control is about 1868. It continues on like this for each family in the table. So the date of effective control in MNO's fact sheet is 1850. In MO's registry policy, it's the mid-1870s to the mid-1880s. And in MNO's registry documents, the date of effective control changes for each family. I'll come back to the information in this table a few minutes from now, because there's something very interesting that I would like you to see. But first, I want to show you the genealogical charts from MNO's verified Métis family documents. Those documents are the basis for MNO's membership register, as well as the historic Métis community of Killarney. In each of their family line documents, MNO includes a chart that shows all the individuals in the family, along with those they declared to be a documented Métis. So on this chart in the box titled Legend, there are several symbols, one of which is a yellow circle, and that's the mark that is used to note who has been declared a documented Métis. So in looking at the Recollet-Ignace family chart, I began to wonder what that chart would look like if it showed only the documented Métis people of that family. So I covered all the people who are not documented Métis. And I'm going to show you what the chart looks like. I only show the direct descendants. If there are in-laws in there who were named documented Métis, I don't show them in the chart because they are going to show up in the family that they belong with. I'm not going to count them twice. So on the far right, you're going to see the direct descendants of Marguerite Recollet that MNO declared to be documented Métis. So out of these people, there are 7 documented Métis, including Marguerite Recollet and 6 of her grandchildren from the Cooper family. The chart on the far right is for Madeleine Recollet and her descendants. Madeleine was a sister to Marguerite. She married Bernard Gijakopanense, and as you can see, MNO did not identify anyone in her family as documented Métis. On the main family chart, I put yellow lines surrounding Madeleine Recollet's family so you could see how much of her family takes up that verified Métis family chart when there's no documented Métis in her family. Here's the chart for the Tranchemontagne family. And there were two siblings. One was Joseph and the other was Marie. Let's look first at the family of Joseph Tranchemontagne, who has been declared documented Métis by MNO. There's one documented Métis in Joseph's descendants. Actually, it's not in Joseph's descendants. It's Joseph himself who has been declared documented Métis, and he's the only one. In the chart on the far right are shown Marie Tranchemontagne's descendants, who have been declared to be documented Métis. And as you can see, there's no one. Marie is the one who married a Pilot. She's the foremother of all the Pilot family. And none of them have been declared documented Métis. So why is her family in MNO's register as a verified Métis family line? The yellow lines that I put on the main chart show the family of Marie Tranchemontagne Pilot. That's the section of this family line that has no documented Métis person in it. Here's the Lamorandiere Shepard verified Métis family line. And let's see who in this family has been declared documented Métis. In the chart on the far right, there are 5 documented Métis in this family. And that is Elizabeth King and 3 of her children who lived on Manitoulin Island, and Pierre Regis de Lamorandiere. These are the only documented Métis of the de Lamorandiere family. The Solomon verified Métis family. Let's see who in this large family group has been declared a documented Métis. For the Killarney Historic Métis community, there are 12 documented Métis in the Solomon family. One is Henry Solomon, the first, Dominic Solomon, both of them lived in Killarney. James Solomon, a son of Henry, lived in Killarney for a time also, but moved out with his family. And a grandchild of Henry named William Alexander Solomon and his 8 children are also named documented Métis, but they didn't live in Killarney. They lived at Sagamok. This table shows, for each family group in MNO's membership register, the total number of documented Métis and the total number of ancestors for each of our families. I didn't count for either total the people who married into the family. Those people would be counted in their original families, so that way no one is counted twice. So for the de Lamorandières, there are 5 documented Métis out of a total of 68 de Lamorandières. The Solomons are the biggest family group, with 185 Solomons and only 12 documented Métis. So there are a total of 25 documented Métis out of 426 ancestors. That's only 6% of the ancestors. And that's not the same as 6% of the people who lived in our community, because MNO didn't include all of our families in their register. When MNO and Ontario talk about the history of the historic Métis community of Killarney, they talk only about the history of Killarney Village, the people of Killarney Village, and the events that happened in Killarney Village. So we're going to look only at the documented Métis of Killarney Village. There are 3 people that MNO lists with the Lamorandiere family that grew up on Manitoulin Island. So we're going to remove them from the total. Also, there are 9 people in the Solomon documented Métis who are actually from the Sagamok Reserve. They never lived in Killarney. So we're going to remove those people from these totals also. So here are the 13 documented Métis of Killarney Village, and they represent 3% of the 426 ancestors. Elizabeth King, who was born a Prue, lived most of her life outside of Killarney, but she was born and raised here, and she left here in the 1890s, so I left her on the list. James Solomon, son of Henry I, left here as an adult, so I also left his name on the list. These 13 people did not all live in our community at the same time. So I created another chart to show when these documented Métis were living in Killarney Village. In the bottom table, in the column marked DM, I'm showing you how many documented Métis there were in each family. And in the rest of the columns, I'm showing you how many in each family were documented Métis during each decade. For the Lamorandières, there were 2 documented Métis in Shepard between the years 1820 and 1899. MNO includes the Cooper children in the family history chart of the Recollet Rock family because they were grandchildren of Marguerite Recollet. That's why if you look at the Recollet Rock family, there's a total of 7 people in the documented Métis column. According to MNO's register, there were no documented Métis in the village of Shepard during the 1820s or the 1830s. The first documented Métis shows up in the 1840s. Along the bottom row are the totals. So the total number of documented Métis for all the families in Shepard was 13. But in the 1840s, there were only 4 documented Métis in the village. In the 1850s, there were only 5 documented Métis, etc., until the 1890s, when there are only 11 documented Métis living in Shepard. And remember also, in that YouTube video that MNO uploaded to their channel in 2021, they said that in the 1830s, the Killarney Métis were all speaking Michif. And in 1836, the Killarney Métis were all dancing to the fiddle at the house of the Métis trader. And in 1838, the Killarney Métis petitioned the government for land. But they actually didn't identify anyone in our community as documented Métis until the 1840s. Now let's look at the entire historic Métis community. In this table, I've included the families outside Killarney Village and organized the data according to the year that MNO says each family arrived in the historic Métis community. That beige column represents the date of effective control, 1850. Marie-Anne de Lamorandiere arrived in the Métis community in 1839. However, Marie-Anne is not a documented Métis, so it doesn't really matter when she arrived in the Métis community. So I'm going to take that date out of there, but I will put in the first de Lamorandiere that they call a documented Métis, which is Pierre Regis, and he arrived in 1844. That's when he was born. Marguerite Recollet arrived in the Métis community when she married Ferdinand Rock in Wikwemikong in 1849. James Solomon was the first of the Solomons to arrive in the Métis community when he married in Wikwemikong in 1848. Henry Corbier arrived in 1823 at his birth. The Chimanans family first arrived in the community in 1879, which is almost 30 years past the date of effective control. The Tranchemontagnes arrived in the Métis community in 1851, just past the date of control. MNO says the Causley family arrived in 1844, when Florence Causley was born. However, Florence is not one of MNO's documented Métis, so the date she arrived doesn't matter. The first Causley who was a documented Métis was born in 1879, also almost 30 years after the date of effective control. In the upper table, you can see that the Chimanans family and the Causley family both arrived in the Métis community well after effective control. So I took them out of the table. In the lower table, you can see I've taken them out. The Tranchemontagne family arrived in 1851. And I don't know how strict people normally are with this effective control date, so I left them in. And the next thing I'm going to show you is a map of the Killarney Métis community, and this time it's going to show you all of the documented Métis who arrived in the community before 1850. The documented Métis ancestors that MNO says were in the historic community of Killarney before 1850 consist of 6 Anishinaabe people in 3 different communities. There are only 2 documented Métis on the North Shore, even though MNO claims a giant area that was widely and repeatedly acknowledged as Ojibwe territory. Number 5, Pierre de Lamorandiere, was only 6 years old in 1850. And number 6, Joseph Tranchemontagne, might not even belong in this data because he arrived in MNO's Métis community 1 year after effective control. There are lots of questions to be answered, but for MNO and Ontario, it's a pretty simple story. These 6 half-breed Indians showed up in 3 different Indian communities before 1850. So that turned all of the territory on this map into a great big Métis community. Next week, I'll be talking about the evidence used by the province of Ontario to declare our ancestors to be Métis. And I'll also be talking about the joint fact sheet issued by MNO and Ontario in 2017, all about the historic Métis community of Killarney.